Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here this morning to talk with you about rural livability, which is a topic that I have a lot of interest in. I've been working with rural communities in Wisconsin for more than 20 years, and I've seen a lot of changes in our communities that are some good in some ways and not so good in other ways. And I think this is a real opportunity for us to really move our rural communities forward by understanding some of the assets and challenges that they face. And the Rural Livability Project is something that was obviously spearheaded by the Institute for Rural Partnerships, and we do thank Senator Baldwin's office for getting this project off the ground. But I do also want to note that this work is also being supported by Dr. Tessa Conroy, who is the PI on this, someone that has a lot of interest in this topic as well, and will be a great resource for this initiative going forward. Now, think about rural livability. Livability means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it can almost be somewhat of a loaded word. If we say that rural areas aren't livable, that connotes that everything is bad everywhere in rural areas, and we know that that's not true. So we're trying to understand why some communities are more successful than others, given different topics and different measures. So really, we're trying to have a better understanding of the factors that contribute to both those rural challenges and those rural successes. Now, unfortunately, when we talk about rural areas, many times we face this narrative that there are a lot of negative things going on. We're having depopulation. We're facing industrial restructuring. We have high mortality rates, low housing availability, and all these other challenges that we hear about from time to time facing rural areas. But we know that that's not true everywhere. We know that there's many communities throughout the rural continuum that are doing well in many different areas. And really the idea is, how can we learn from those places? How can we find case studies or outliers that really help us move other communities forward by learning from those successes? We also want to understand factors like regional interactions. We want to understand path dependency. Are there paths that communities go down based on decisions made a decade ago or 2 decades ago that impact their ability to succeed now? And then also, how do we better understand the outcomes of livability from the drivers of livability? So many times we think about a community in terms of how successful it is based on whether or not it has, for instance, a vibrant downtown. Now, is that vibrant downtown an outcome or a driver of livability in that community? And finally, based on all this research that we'll be doing over the next couple of years, are there opportunities for us to create blueprints or other strategies for communities that they can learn from and implement in their own communities to help them move forward and grow? Now, one of the challenges is, how do we define what's livable? And again, that's going to be different to different people, and it might be different to different parts of rural United States and rural Wisconsin for that matter. And many times when we think about what makes a community successful, we like to focus on kind of traditional economic measures, things like population growth, the number of jobs or number of employment opportunities in the community. How high is our income? Are our wages growing? And what's our gross domestic product? Now, those can be good measures, but we also know that not every place that is growing is necessarily doing well or is necessarily livable. We also know that some places that are somewhat stable in their population may be very livable as well. We also know that there are places that have very high incomes that are not very livable for a lot of people that either live there now or may want to live there. The other challenge we face is that when you use a lot of these traditional measures, it follows a kind of traditional blueprint for how we think about community economic development. We think about the fact that if we attract these businesses or attract this investment in our community, it'll help grow population and jobs, which may happen. We also have to think about the fact that we don't always follow that pattern. We have to think about whether or not people follow jobs or jobs follow people. And if jobs follow people, that is, if people are picking quality communities to live in for one reason or another, that is something that's different from simply looking at whether or not employment is growing in our community. So let's think about some different ways that we can think about livability going forward as part of this initiative. And I think a number of other speakers will build upon some of these themes as we go through the afternoon. So just kind of a big picture perspective. Let's think about percent change in population by county from 2000 to 2010, so the prior decade. The darker the red, the higher the percentage growth in population in that county on a percentage basis. The darker the blue, the greater the percentage loss. Now, if we look across the country, we do see a number of patterns. We see certainly growth throughout the Sun Belt. We see growth around large metropolitan areas. But we do see in rural areas kind of a variability in growth rates. Now let's step forward to the next decade, 2010 to 2020. So again, we do see some of those similar patterns existing, but we also see that there's a number of shifts that happen throughout the United States in terms of population growth rates, with growth rates slowing in a lot of places. And in Wisconsin, we also saw some places that were negative in their growth rate in the prior decade that went from negative to positive. So they went from a population loss to a population gain. So the question is, what are some of the factors that are driving that? And again, is that necessarily the measure that we want to use to define what's livable? The other challenge we face is an issue of definition. How do we define rural to begin with? So a lot of times when we think about rural, we try to divide places into metropolitan areas and non-metropolitan areas. So this looks at those areas that are part of a metropolitan statistical area in the state of Wisconsin and how that's changed over time. And we see that the dark red counties are those that were part of an MSA back in the 1950s, all the way up through kind of the lighter red, the pink, to the most recent changes in definition to MSAs. Now, what this also means is that rural communities evolve over time. They may not always be part of that same definition. And this is somewhat problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, let's just look at how this has changed over time using the current MSA definitions, or the most current definitions we have for the state of Wisconsin and the United States. And going back to 1970, you see how population has changed. The orange line, oh, we're losing our part of our legend here. The dark orange line you see there are the non-metro counties in the state of Wisconsin. The light orange lines are the non-metro areas in the United States. So you'll see that over time, especially coming out of the 1990s, our metropolitan areas grew faster than the national average. We can also see that our non-metropolitan areas grew faster than our metro areas. This changed more recently coming out of the Great Recession, but for the most part, over time, they grew faster. However, both areas grew much, much slower than the metropolitan areas on a national basis. Now, this uses those constant definitions from 2023. Let's go back and see how this has changed using 1970 definitions and using the most current definitions we have, and for the state of Wisconsin. So here we have the current metropolitan definitions and the current non-metro definitions, and we saw that on the same slide before, that growth pattern over time. But what if we go back to 1970 and just use those counties that were metro areas then? We can see a different pattern then. We didn't see that rate slow down. We actually saw that growth continue to occur using those definitions and continue to grow faster than our metropolitan areas. So why does this matter? Let's think about those metro counties that have been added more recently to the definitions in the state of Wisconsin. We see places like O'Connell County, Kewaunee, Iowa, Greene, Kures, Lincoln, Columbia. This is the share of residents in those counties that live in rural census blocks. And we can see in some counties, it's over 0.75%. So would we call these counties urban? I don't think so. We can also look at a place like St. Croix County, which has been part of a metropolitan statistical area for a long time. And we can see that almost 2/3 of the people living in St. Croix County, one of the fastest growing counties traditionally in the state of Wisconsin, live in rural areas. So again, if we just simply try and lump communities or places into a definition based on kind of these federal categories, we're probably missing some nuances of what's happening in communities. Now, the reason that some of those areas were included as part of the MSA definitions is because of their commuting patterns. If they send a certain share of their population into a core county in an MSA, they become part of that MSA. So here we're looking at kind of the commuting networks across non-metro counties in the state of Wisconsin, and we can see that there are very, very intricate commuting patterns across space. We can see that non-metro counties send a lot of people into surrounding counties, as well as into metropolitan counties that may be a further distance away. So when we think about rural livability, we can't just think about our communities in a silo. We have to think about how they may interact with the economies around us as well. And we can see that this has changed over time. This is the share of residents in a community, in a county commuting to another county for their place of employment. We can see back in 2002, there are many counties that did have a very high share of people commuting out for their place of employment, but that has grown over time. And we see very high shares in many Wisconsin counties, especially non-metropolitan counties across the state. So again, how do these changes impact livability? And how do these interactions across space and across time impact how we think about whether or not a community is succeeding or not? Let's use another one of those traditional measures, change in wage and salary employment. Let's use metro and non-metro areas. Here we can see that Wisconsin's non-metro areas grew faster in wage and salary employment over time than our national peers. We can also see that traditionally our non-metro areas in the state of Wisconsin in terms of employment grew faster than both state and national metro areas. But we can see that with the onset of the Great Recession, we dropped and we've never come back in our non-metropolitan areas. We still have yet to reach our full employment prior to the Great Recession in our non-metropolitan areas. We also see how our metropolitan areas have increased in employment over time and have now caught our non-metropolitan areas. Okay, so why did this happen? We can think about this from different perspectives, and again, this influences how we may think about livability. Let's think about one aspect of industrial restructuring. Let's look at change in manufacturing employment in metro and non-metro areas over time. And we can see that non-metro areas grew very heavily in terms of manufacturing employment over time. Were hit very hard with the turn of the century. Were hit hard again with the Great Recession, but have come back. So this maybe we have to ask the question, is this a dependence? Is this a sign of resilience? Or is this an opportunity given to some of the changes we're seeing to supply chains and reshoring and so on and so forth? Again, do we have the answer to this? No, but these are the types of factors that we have to consider and what may impact a community's livability going forward. We can also think about whether or not this lack of employment gain is due to simply labor availability. This looks at change in total working age population, so the population aged 15 to 64 from 2000 to 2022 estimates, as well as prime working age population, individuals aged 25 to 54. And we can see that in terms of total working age population, there are only 12 Wisconsin counties that have an estimated growth over this period. The other ones lost total working age population. There's only 2 Wisconsin counties that have an estimated growth in their prime working age population, Dane and Eau Claire. We can see very significant losses in other counties. So again, is this inability to grow employment back to the pre-recession levels a factor of industry composition, or is it a factor of labor availability, or just something else altogether? We can also think about how other ways our population has changed in rural areas. Here we have population age 65 and over by county from 2000 census up to 2022 estimates. And again, we kind of see the flip of what we saw before on the prior map. Growing shares of individuals age 65 or older or at or nearing retirement age in many Wisconsin counties, particularly in our rural counties in northern Wisconsin and central Wisconsin. So these shifts also have to make us think about livability in terms of livability for who? Are we trying to be livable for young workers? Are we trying to be livable for retirees? Are we trying to be livable for everyone in our community, regardless of their age or their demographics or their other contributions to the economy? So again, these are the types of questions we have to ask ourselves. So when we think about this, we also have to think about if we're trying to address livability for different people, people depend upon different critical institutions. They depend upon industries like healthcare, education, pharmacies, veterinary clinics, broadband, banks. I was in Campbellsport a couple months ago. They talked about how they lost their lawyer in town, and that was a big challenge for a lot of people living there. So as we think about how we may have lost a lot of these institutions in our rural communities, what does this mean for a community's ability to retain the people they may have there or attract new people that may depend upon these types of critical goods and services? Let's end talking a little bit about how we might identify livable communities and think about people's behavior. We can think about things like places that may have a high in-migration. Is that a signal that people want to live there because they're coming there? We can think about low out-migration. Is that an indicator that people who were there that want to stay? Or perhaps maybe they face barriers to moving that may have otherwise moved for one reason or another. A stable or high birth rate, home value appreciation, new business startups. All of these may be some sort of indicators of rural livability based on people's actions living in those places. Okay, so let's just take one. Let's look at migration real quickly. So here are net domestic migration rates by county. So in the year prior to the start of the pandemic, The darker the red, the higher the net migration rate on a positive basis for that county. The darker the blue, the greater the population loss due to outmigration. Now, this is net migration, so we don't know if these changes or these values are due to people who may have moved there or people who may have stayed there who may have otherwise moved. So we don't know the in and out differences. Okay, let's step forward to the period after the start of the pandemic. We can see that there were many Wisconsin counties and many other counties across the country that went from negative to positive or went from positive to even a greater positive rate. So we see many more dark reds throughout the state of Wisconsin as well as in other places. And we see a similar pattern from 2021 to 2022. But we don't see this across every rural area uniformly. And we don't see every rural area went from negative to positive or grew in an even greater positive way. What we can do is look at some other characteristics that may have influenced these differences. So let's think about seasonal recreational housing. Let's think about natural assets that may be there and use the share of seasonal recreational housing as kind of a proxy for attractiveness to natural assets. And we can see that many Wisconsin counties have some of the highest shares of seasonal recreational housing of any place in the entire country. Some of the highest numbers as well, especially in northern and central Wisconsin. So let's look at just those counties that are considered to be what are called recreational counties in non-metro areas and compare them to all non-metro counties that are non-recreational and look at the patterns for net migration. Here we can see that non-metro, non-recreational counties did not see the growth in net migration that we saw in non-metro, non-recreational counties, those orange bars. We can also see that this is a pattern that started before the pandemic, but was exacerbated after the pandemic. So one of the things we see here is that this is an indicator in some way that people want to be in these places that have these types of assets. Now, does every community have these types of assets? Not necessarily, but they do have assets they could build upon that might be a lesson for other communities that are trying to shift this population dynamic. Finally, we can also think about what are known as community capitals. We have all these other assets that are available in communities that we can measure and we can learn from in terms of how important they are for livability. So we have natural capital, which may be natural amenities, which is talked about, built capital, which would be critical institutions, infrastructure, housing, social capital, how people interact with one another, human capital, the skills and education that people have that are living in the community, what are their mental and physical healths as well, cultural capital, political capital, financial capital, and so on and so forth. All these are different factors that can influence a community's livability, and how can we better understand how we measure these and how we can determine whether or not they are drivers of livability in different communities across the rural urban continuum. And finally, our hope is that with all of this, we can take this information and create what are called typologies and potential blueprints for communities. So if you're a community that has these types of assets that may be, for instance, high natural amenity, older demographic, high income, large tourism industry, are there specific initiatives that make better sense for you than other places that you may want to undertake to help make your community a livable place? And we're going to try and do that for many different rural areas across Wisconsin as well as the United States. With that, my contact information is there. I'm happy to answer questions later on after we're done. And I want to thank you all for your time. Thank you so much.